On January 25, 1943, an explosion shook the ruins of Stalingrad, a city desolated after enduring for more than 6 months a brutal siege by the German army. The explosion was so big that shrapnel struck Generaloberst Friedrich Paulus, a strategist with an academic background who had risen to command an entire army on the battlefield. Seriously wounded, Paulus watched as his troops, previously positioned west of the city, began to lose ground while Soviet forces advanced toward the Seydlitz River. The orders that came from Berlin, directly from the Führer's mouth, were very clear. The army will resist to the last man and the last bullet. According to Nazi ideology, surrendering or retreating amounted to short of treason and was punished by death on most cases. But in this case, Hitler's orders decided the total failure of attempts to break the Soviet encirclement, as well as the unrealistic plan of Hermann Göring, head of the Luftwaffe, to supply the encircled troops by air. Hitler refused to authorize a surrender. Accepting it would mean a symbolic catastrophe for the regime and a powerful propaganda victory for the enemy. In this context, the troops of the 21st and 62nd Soviet armies were tightening the noose day by day, isolating the Germans into pockets of resistance, first two, one in the north and a smaller one in the south, and then even fragmenting the larger one. During those final days of January, several hundred German soldiers attempted to flee, either in small groups or alone. Some officers considered breaking through the siege to reach their own lines, but most attempts ended in failure. Those few who managed to escape were so weakened and ill that they could barely stand and had to be evacuated immediately to the rear. On January 28, 1943, cornered, out of ammunition and facing imminent collapse, Paulus sent a desperate message to Hitler: "May our sacrifice serve as an eternal example to never surrender." All was lost for Paulus's 6th Army. Paulus had been appointed as the commander of the 6th Army in December 1941 and had successfully led his troops to important victories in Russia. His 6th Army had its trial by fire in May 1942 when Paulus's 300,000 troops met Semyon Timoshenko's 640,000 men at Volchansk. They did not stand a chance against such a superior manpower, but after regrouping at a position close to Kharkov, Paulus ordered a counterattack that crushed the opposing forces, killing or wounding 250,000 Red Army troops. He earned his Knight's Cross for this heroic action. Afterwards, he went on to occupy 90% of the city of Stalingrad at the heart of the Soviet Union in November 1942. However, his plan of taking the city in a short time failed, and Stalin began funneling reinforcements to Stalingrad immediately. The Soviets had an apparently unending supply of men, but the huge distances inside the Soviet Union meant that logistical issues were their worst enemy inside their territory. General Zhukov was the one ordered to break the German siege over Stalingrad, and by the end of January 1943, it became obvious that Paulus and his men were trapped between Zhukov's army and a city they could not conquer entirely. On January 30th, coinciding with the 10th anniversary of Hitler's rise to power, the soldiers of the 6th Army finally realized they were alone. Nobody would come to rescue them, and there was no point in awaiting aerial support. To make matters worse, Paulus had become ill with dysentery and was unable to direct his troops efficiently. However, he refused to be replaced in his duties by another general. In a mournful speech, Hermann Göring compared the resistance in Stalingrad to the heroic stand of the Spartans at Thermopylae. But the German fighters were still alive, trapped and awaiting an inevitable end. That same day, Paulus informed the Führer that his men could not hold out much longer. In response, Hitler promoted him to Field General, expecting him to choose death over surrender. He was a firm believer in symbolism, and as no German Field Marshal had ever surrendered in history, Hitler thought this would prompt Paulus to follow suit. But that did not happen. Paulus would become the first German Field Marshal in the country's military history to be captured by the enemy. The sight before the soldiers bagged in the Kessel or cauldron could not have been more disastrous. There were starving, wounded, typhoid-stricken, freezing soldiers. When they lost the only trace of supplies, it was the end. Most of them had holed themselves up in a supermarket with subways called Univermag. The soldiers no longer had any fighting morale. Moreover, the city already had the appearance of a tomb, with the smell of cadaverous decay covering the entire city. 90% of the buildings were destroyed, and the scene was appalling. Finally, Soviet soldiers descended into the underground where Paulus and the rest of the Sixth Army were hiding and offered him surrender. Paulus accepted on the 2nd of February 1943. Before marching into captivity, the German soldiers were forced to clear the rubble in the city, collected their dead comrades and arranged them in piles on the outskirts of the city to be cremated. They were then transported by train to Siberia, with a large number of the soldiers dying on the journey and later in concentration and labor camps. Although he had surrendered personally, Paulus issued no formal order for his troops to lay down their arms. Some units continued fighting on their own. That same day, the 4th, 8th, 14th Panzer and 51st Corps surrendered under pressure from the Soviet advance. General Shumilov's 64th Army already controlled almost the entire urban center of Stalingrad, with only the 11th Army Corps entrenched in the northern area among rubble, makeshift trenches, and ruined buildings. But Paulus's surrender did not end the troubles for the Germans stationed in Stalingrad. February arrived with a new Soviet assault. The few remaining German positions were concentrated in the Barricadi industrial area and around the old tractor factory, which had been the scene of fierce combat for months. According to radio operator Gottfried Greve of the 194th Signal Battalion, the surviving soldiers were hiding in basements and ruins, badly wounded, starving and shivering with fever. The order they received was as absurd as it was terrifying. "Comrades, we must hold out to the last bullet. It is God's will." Greve realized then that this was not a military order, but a death sentence disguised as heroism. February 2nd marked the definitive end of one of the bloodiest confrontations of the 20th century. The night before, Infantry General Karl Strecker, commander of the 11th Army Corps, had begun communicating with his superior officers to discuss whether to continue fighting or accept the inevitable surrender. At 4 a.m., he contacted Lieutenant General Arno von Lenski, leader of the 24th Panzer Division. Although Strecker insisted on resisting, Lenski had already sent an envoy to negotiate with the Soviets. Thus, Strecker drafted two messages. The first, sent at 7 a.m., ordered his troops to cease combat, destroy their weapons, and wait for the arrival of enemy forces. The second, sent to Army Group Don at 8 a.m., was his official surrender, which he closed not with the typical Heil Hitler, but with a solemn, "Long live Germany." Around midday, the 62nd, 65th and 66th Soviet armies launched their final offensive against the remnants of the German garrison in Stalingrad, still stationed in the industrial facilities of Barricadi and the tractor factory. The defenders, exhausted and completely lacking offensive capability, began to surrender in groups or individually, offering no resistance. Some attempted to flee into the steppe, while others chose to hide in tunnels and ruins. A few, unwilling to surrender, continued fighting without hope. By early March, these last holdouts were located and eliminated by Soviet garrison forces, supported by detachments of the Soviet secret police. Operation Uranus, Zhukov's deadly German trap. The main reason why the Sixth Army had stayed in Stalingrad was that Hitler and his senior staff officers had fatally misread the battlefield. They believed that the main Soviet strength was much further north, around Rzhev, and that the expected Russian winter onslaught would take place there. Russian activity around Stalingrad had been seen as an indication of a relatively small-scale offensive designed to lure German forces out of the city, and the Germans did not want to fall for that old trick. Both Paulus and Hitler were convinced that a Russian attack would take place somewhere near Stalingrad, and they were all equally certain that it would be on a small scale and easily contained. In reality, the Soviets had been quietly and methodically building up their forces for a counterattack at Stalingrad on a grand scale. The plan had been devised on 13th September when Zhukov had gone to Moscow to meet Stalin and his chief of staff, Alexander Vasilevsky. Zhukov and Vasilevsky had concocted a plan to launch simultaneous attacks on the Romanian troops who held the line on either side of the German Sixth Army. These incursions would drive fast and deep to link up behind the Sixth Army and cut it off. They believed that the Red Army had enough strength to mount the strikes, but nothing more. All other planned operations would have to be cancelled, and all reserves would take part in what was dubbed Operation Uranus. After some hesitation, Stalin accepted the plan. He gave Vasilevsky authority to move, equip and train whatever forces were necessary for the plan, But Stalin imposed one condition: absolute secrecy. Nobody, absolutely nobody, was to be told the reason for the changes and movements. Each commander would be kept in ignorance of the fact that his forces were to act as part of a larger enterprise. Only as the time for the offensive drew nearer were a small number of senior planning and command staff to be let in on the secret. As they drew up their plans in secret, Zhukov and Vasilevsky decided on a major change in tactics. They decided, so far as was possible, to copy the Germans' blitzkrieg tactics. Russian tactical doctrine had previously emphasized the importance of units keeping in touch with those on their flanks and advancing only when their flanks were known to be secure. Evidently, this was what the Germans expected the Soviets to do. Instead, now Zhukov began instructing his tank commanders to push forward far and fast, irrespective of what was happening on their flanks. Infantry commanders were told that their new task was to follow the tanks, not lead the assault. Cavalry officers were ordered to abandon their hit-and-run tactics. Instead, they were to ride with the tanks, dismounting to fight as infantry when required. Air units were instructed to cooperate closely with their ground forces, especially the tanks. Not only that, but Zhukov's plan called for a massive concentration of force in a small area to achieve the initial breakthrough, a tactic that had been used only by the Germans so far. The Uranus offensive would be launched at 3 key points. The first was to be at Kletskaya, to the west of Stalingrad. The aim of this drive was to smash a hole in the Romanian front, then swing round to face the Germans outside Stalingrad and keep them occupied. Meanwhile, the main attack would be launched further west at Serafimovich, about 160 kilometers or 100 miles from Stalingrad. This offensive was to smash through the Romanians and then race southeast towards Kalach, driving a deep and expanding wedge into the rear of the Romanian Third Army. A final attack was to be launched to the south of Stalingrad at Plodovitoye. This advance was intended to be deep and fast too, with the target also being Kalach. When the columns met at Kalach, the Germans in Stalingrad would be surrounded and trapped. Zhukov and Vasilevsky estimated that the offensive capabilities of the Red Army would then have been exhausted. The Soviets would then go over to the defensive to hold the ground they had won and prevent the trapped Sixth Army from escaping. Given enough time, Zhukov estimated, Paulus and his men would be starved into surrender. The training and preparations went on for weeks, but it was not until late in October that the men and equipment began to be moved towards Stalingrad. At the same time, those in the front lines were ordered to carry out more intensive patrolling and scouting to ascertain the dispositions of the Romanians and the details of the landscape over which the attacks would be taking place. The movements of the Soviet forces were carried out under the utmost secrecy. Each individual unit knew where it was going but was oblivious of other movements. Russian prisoners and deserters told the Romanians and the Germans about their own regiments, but that was all. Efforts were made to hide the build-up from the Luftwaffe pilots. All troop movements took place at night, with the troops and their equipment remaining motionless under camouflage during the day. There was also a lot of false activity going on to mislead the enemy. At 4 a.m. on the 19th of November, the Russian troops were woken up and given their orders. They had long suspected that an attack was imminent, but not until this late hour did they realize just what was involved. When the tank crews were told they were to plunge so deep and so fast behind the German lines, they cheered. The attack was to begin at dawn. When the sun came up, there was a dense, freezing fog. The attack began on schedule. Zhukov had assembled a huge force for his attack. He had 9 armies, more than 1 million men, 13,000 guns, 894 tanks, and 1,150 aircraft. The size of the effort is shown by the fact that 2/3 of all Soviet tanks in operational condition were thrown into the offensive. The artillery opened up first, swamping the Romanian positions with the heaviest and longest Soviet artillery barrage of the war to date. The Russian artillery was usually accurate, but barrages rarely lasted long due to a lack of ammunition. There was no such problem on this day, and the guns roared continuously. On the morning of 21st November, the second day of the operation, Paulus prepared to send his remaining panzers to assault the left flank of the Russian columns advancing from Kletskaya. Before the attack could be delivered, he heard that Soviet tanks were only 32 kilometers from his headquarters and that another Soviet column was surging northwest from his southern flank. Paulus suddenly realized that his entire army was in danger of encirclement. Just as urgent, most of his supply and support units were in the path of the rapidly advancing Soviets. Orders were hurriedly sent out, alerting them to the danger and telling them to get to safety as fast as possible. He himself abandoned his headquarters as staff tried to pack up papers and equipment and headed east to Stalingrad. The Soviet advance continued after dark as the Germans were thrown into confusion, with units heading in different directions under different orders from different commanders. At 6 a.m., a Soviet tank column coming from the north reached Kalach. Finding no sign of their comrades coming from the east, the tank crews pushed on and at dawn saw T-34 tanks advancing towards them. The encirclement was complete. The Sixth Army was surrounded. The German besiegers of Stalingrad now were besieged by the Red Army. Still, it would take the Soviets 2 more months to finally break the heroic resistance of Friedrich Paulus. On February 3, 1943, the Luftwaffe made its final flight over the devastated skies of Stalingrad. A lone Heinkel, He-11 flew over the ruined city, searching for possible groups of German soldiers who might have escaped the Soviet encirclement. The plane dropped supplies in the hope of finding survivors, but detected no signs of life among the frozen rubble. That flight symbolized the end of a colossal battle that left nearly 2 million dead, wounded, or missing, and became one of the fiercest and most decisive confrontations of the 20th century. Operation Uranus, masterfully planned by Soviet Marshal Georgy Zhukov, achieved its main goal: to encircle and destroy the German Sixth Army. For the Red Army, it was the first major strategic victory with irreversible consequences. It represented not only territorial gain, but also a moral revival that transformed the course of the war on the Eastern Front. To paraphrase Churchill, for the Soviet Union, it was the beginning of the end of Nazi terror. For Hitler's Germany, by contrast, Stalingrad marked the beginning of the collapse, the first time the Reich's war machine truly broke down before an unstoppable enemy. A fate worse than death. What happened to the German prisoners? At 4 p.m. on the day Paulus was captured, February 2nd, Generals Konstantin Rokossovsky and Nikolai Voronov sent an official report to the High Command in Moscow announcing the definitive fall of Stalingrad and the total cessation of military operations in the city and its surroundings. As noted by the Chief of Staff of the 62nd Army, Nikolai Krylov, the day was surprisingly quiet in terms of active combat. However, the number of prisoners rose dramatically. About 40,000 more German soldiers surrendered that day, adding to the 50,000 captured on January 31. Many gathered blankets, coats, or any clothing they could find, anticipating that the march to the prisoner camps would be long, frozen, and painful. At the same time, negotiations took place between Infantry General Strecker and a Soviet General Staff officer who accompanied him after his surrender. They agreed that the German headquarters officers could be transported in vehicles to their place of captivity. However, they would use their own vehicles, as the Soviets lacked sufficient resources and there would be no transport for everyone. Several officers, including some of high rank, had to begin their march to captivity on foot through the snow in the silence of a war that had already ended for them. The harshness of Soviet concentration camps was well known to the Germans, who had heard hundreds of stories about how hard it was to endure life there. The battle for Stalingrad had stretched German supply lines, and the sheer scale of destruction meant that many of the German soldiers captured were already half dead from the cold and malnutrition. This was then compounded by their being marched for days to the nearest available railhead and then shipped to collection camps that were themselves little more than enclosures. In Krasnoarmeysk, there were buildings without roofs, and at Beketovka, the accommodation consisted of buildings in an evacuated village. Medical attention was minimal, sanitary arrangements non-existent, and heating impossible. Between 3rd February and 10th June 1943, half of the camp population of 27,078 had died. Due to the enormous number of prisoners captured after the surrender in Stalingrad on February 3, 1943, Prisoner Camp number 108 was opened in Beketovka, an area near the city. However, the facilities quickly proved insufficient to handle such a human avalanche, and the Directorate of Prisoners of War in Stalingrad ordered the opening of new internment centers in various parts of the region. Despite these efforts, the prisoner population began to decrease drastically. Untreated wounds, infections, extreme hunger, and severe weather conditions caused the deaths of thousands. In places like the Yushki camp, it is estimated that around 70% of the inmates died from causes related to malnutrition. The taking of prisoners at Stalingrad was very cruel. Rounded up by the Red Army, they were often systematically plundered of watches, rings, clothing, leather belts and boots at gunpoint, and fingers were cut off where rings could not be removed. From collection point, they were moved to camps in the vicinity, but these were again often little more than enclosures. The marches themselves claimed many lives, mainly due to the cold and unforgiving winter conditions in Russia. Thousands of German soldiers and officers would freeze to death on the way to the camps. Those who could walk had to. Stopping on their tracks or refusing to go forward always ended in the soldiers being shot by the Soviets and left to rot on the open at the side of the road. In all the camps, there were deaths every night and many gruesome stories. One guard spoke of a burial party realizing that one of the corpses they had thrown in a pit was still alive, so the man was dragged out until he had died and then put back. The camp population included Romanians, Italians and Bulgarians as well as Germans, and the lack of early medical assistance also played a role in the numbers dying, as did the hatred of the prisoners by both the Soviet soldiers and the local civilian population, which meant that there was no chance of any pity or additional food being forthcoming. This animosity was not confined to the Soviets, as the captured Romanians hated their German officers sufficiently to have drowned them all while crossing the Volga River. By the spring of 1943, the Soviet Office for Prisoners of War had begun detailed registration of its prisoners and commenced their transport to permanent camps, mainly in Begovat, Uzbekistan, Astrakhan and Karaganda. The journeys could last for days or weeks with only intermittent access to food and water. Of the first 30,000 sent in this way, only around 15,000 arrived alive. By the end of the conflict, the reality was devastating. Of the more than 90,000 German soldiers who surrendered at Stalingrad, only about 6,000 managed to return to Germany years later. But this was only after several years of captivity, with the first prisoners being released in 1949 and more along the 1950s. The fate of the remaining prisoners was explicitly tied to Soviet West German diplomacy in the aftermath of Stalin. In May 1955, the Western powers had suspended the Statute of Occupation, thus effectively making West Germany an independent state with Konrad Adenauer as Chancellor. Successful in gaining Soviet recognition of his country during a visit to Moscow, he was also able to negotiate the return of the remaining prisoners in Soviet captivity. Of the 9,626 men still in Soviet captivity in 1955, 8,877 had been formally pardoned by the Soviets, but the remaining 749 were not amnestied, but handed over as having committed the most serious war crimes, the last of them arriving in January 1956. General Walter Kurt von Seydlitz-Kurzbach had been in Soviet hands since January 1943, having been relieved of his command by Paulus at Stalingrad. They both joined the National Committee for a Free Germany, and Paulus testified in the Nuremberg trials in 1946. He was freed by the Soviets in 1953 and managed to live a further 4 years in Dresden, where he died on February 1, 1957. General Walter von Seydlitz, a victim of Soviet propaganda. The Sixth Army had 4 artillery and infantry corps under its command. The 51st Corps was commanded by General Walter von Seydlitz, a member of one of the most famous military families in Germany and veteran of World War I. The 51st Army Corps had an important role in the Battle of Stalingrad, and Seydlitz himself was celebrated for his bravery and strategy abilities. Seydlitz, a member of the military aristocracy that went back to the times of Frederick II, grew increasingly dissatisfied with the way Hitler managed his armies at Stalingrad. However, he could not voice his complaints, as Hitler was known for harshly punishing those who dared contradict him. Furthermore, Hitler believed that military defeats were only due to a lack of willpower, so to him it did not matter that his armies were outnumbered. Surrendering had only one explanation, and that was cowardice. Thus, Hitler ordered the Sixth Army that was besieging Stalingrad to defend their positions no matter what. This order was resisted by Seydlitz, who considered it completely unthinkable that an army with 22 divisions should go into all-round defense and thus deprive itself of all freedom of movement. He prepared a long memorandum on the subject for Headquarters Sixth Army. Already the minor defensive battles over the last few days have used up our ammunition reserves, he explained. The supply situation was decisive. Their orders were to ignore the catastrophic order to stay put. On the evening of 23rd November, Seydlitz ordered 60th Motorized Infantry Division and the 94th Infantry Division to burn their stores and blow up their positions, then withdraw from their positions on the north side of Stalingrad. In thousands of rapidly lit fires, they burned overcoats, uniforms, boots, documents, maps, typewriters, as well as food supplies. The general burned all his own equipment himself. The Red Army, alerted by the explosions and flames, caught the already weakened division in the open as it withdrew from Spartakovka and inflicted nearly 1,000 casualties. The neighboring formation, the 389th Infantry Division in the Stalingrad tractor plant, also suffered in the confusion. Hitler, furious to hear of this withdrawal, blamed Paulus. To prevent any further disobedience to his orders, he made the extraordinary decision to split the command in Stalingrad. General von Seydlitz, whom he believed to be a fanatic of resistance, was made commander-in-chief of the northeastern part of the area, including Stalingrad itself. The signal arrived at 6 a.m. on November 25th. Seydlitz was notified of these orders by Paulus himself. Hitler's orders proved catastrophic for the Sixth Army in Stalingrad. On the one hand, it seriously weakened the army because now two generals often took different approaches to fighting, but on the other hand, it gave Seydlitz and Paulus more freedom to decide strategy. Of course, this freedom did not supersede the other of Hitler's orders, which was to fight until the last man and until the last bullet but one. It was for this reason that, when the Soviets broke the German defenses in late January 1943 and Seydlitz attempted to surrender together with the officers under his command, Paulus immediately relieved him of his command. He appointed General Walter Heitz in place of Seydlitz, and Heitz ordered the surrendering Germans to be shot. 2 German officers were killed by other Germans after surrendering. Seydlitz and Paulus hated each other, especially since Seydlitz was not a fanatic of the Führer and frequently spoke ill of him and gave orders to his subordinates that contradicted those of the leader. He has his own ideas regarding what needed to be done in Stalingrad. As soon as he was placed in an officer's prisoner of war camp, he started complaining about Hitler, whom he saw as the harbinger of catastrophe for Germany. This was duly noted by his interrogators. On 19 August 1943, 3 Stalingrad generals, Seydlitz, Lattmann and Korfus, were identified as potential collaborators and thus sent to a so-called re-education center at Lunovo. In these centers, German officers were fed Soviet propaganda and treated fairly in order to create the illusion that the Soviets were their friends and were only trying to free Germany from the rule of a madman. According to Soviet intelligence reports, Seydlitz appears to have been emotionally overwhelmed by what he believed was a collective change of heart of many officers, all wanting to save Germany from the Hitlerian apocalypse. He saw himself as their natural leader. Early in September, Seydlitz, Korfus and Lattmann were sent back to Voikovo to win over the other Stalingrad generals. Their arrival late at night brought the generals out of their rooms in their pajamas, intrigued to hear what all the excitement was about. But when Seydlitz announced his plan to overthrow Hitler, General Strecker turned away angrily. And next day, when Seydlitz and Lattmann urged them to join in calling for a revolt against Hitler's regime, Strecker, Sixt von Arnim, Rodenberg and Pfeffer accused them angrily of treason. Seydlitz and his colleagues did, however, win over Generals Edler von Daniels, Dreber and Schlomer. Soviet documents show that on 17 September 1943, Seydlitz, as president of the League of German Officers, presented a plan to Soviet General Melnikov, which proposed raising an army corps of 30 or 40,000 men from those captured at Stalingrad. According to Seydlitz's idea, this corps would be the base for the new government after Hitler is overthrown. Seydlitz considered himself a candidate for the job of chief commander of the armed forces of Free Germany in the future. He apparently also promised to prepare a plan for a press and radio propaganda campaign, sending men to the German rear to win over formation commanders to our side and to organize joint action against Hitler's regime. Seydlitz would send messages to his personal friends, the commander of the Central Front, von Kluge, and General Thomas, who is responsible for Hitler's headquarters staff. In February 1944, Russian aircraft started dropping leaflets over Germany and frontline troops signed by Seydlitz and his colleagues. The Gestapo provided an urgent report for Himmler verifying that Seydlitz's signature was genuine. General Giele of the Waffen-SS, whose troops in the Cherkasy salient were showered with leaflets from the National Committee, sent copies back to Germany. He also passed back personal letters addressed to him from Generals Seydlitz and Korfus, who had been sent to his part of the front by Scherbakov. The handwriting was again analyzed by the Gestapo and confirmed as accurate. The leaflets caused panic. Hitler summoned Himmler for a meeting, then sent General Schmundt off with a declaration of loyalty for field marshals to sign. Even this was not enough to reassure him. On the 19th of March, Rundstedt, Rommel, Kleist, Busch, Weichs and Manstein were summoned from their duties to the Berghof to read out a message condemning General von Seydlitz-Kurzbach, the contemptible traitor to our holy cause, and emphasizing their support for Hitler. Other Soviet documents confirm that Seydlitz's idea of creating an anti-Nazi force of some 40,000 German prisoners of war to be airlifted into Germany was never seriously considered. In Germany, his family was taken into detention for the crimes of a family member. In Russia, in 1949, he was charged with war crimes. He was put on trial for responsibility for actions against Soviet prisoners of war and the civilian population while in service of the German army. In 1950, a Soviet tribunal sentenced him to 25 years of imprisonment, but in 1955 he was released to West Germany, where in 1956 his Third Reich death sentence was nullified. Seydlitz was ultimately exploited by both Soviet and German propaganda. He was used by the former in broadcasts and literature to encourage German soldiers to surrender, and by the Germans to fight for a cause in which he did not really believed. Aftermath of the Nazi defeat at Stalingrad, the beginning of the end. It is almost impossible to overestimate the importance of the German disaster at Stalingrad. In the campaign as a whole, the Wehrmacht had lost perhaps 15% of its strength, but had gained almost nothing. It was a pointless campaign and a military error that eventually costed Hitler the war and his life. One of the main reasons why Stalingrad was so catastrophic was because it marked a watershed point in the common Germans' belief in the state propaganda. Despite Goebbels' best efforts, the scale of the disaster could not be hidden. Almost every civilian in Germany knew a family who had lost a son at Stalingrad. The sense of shock in Germany was great, but the blow to the morale of the soldiers was greater. Ever since the invasion of Russia had begun, they had known nothing but victory, even if those battlefield successes had not translated into final victory. Now they had suffered a battlefield defeat, and one of massive proportions. The self-belief of the German soldiers had been badly dented and, in many cases, destroyed. They no longer viewed the Russians as poor soldiers to be defeated, but as tough opponents of whom it paid to be wary. On 18 February 1943, Goebbels delivered his famous Sportpalast speech, so named because it was delivered to a large invited audience at the Berlin Sportpalast, or Palace of Sport. This was the first speech in which any Nazi leader admitted that the war was not proceeding smoothly for Germany. He outlined the setbacks on the Eastern Front, explained that the whole future of European civilization was at threat from a communist takeover, and stated that only Germany could save Europe. He reached a climax by asking his audience, and via radio the entire German people, the following question: do you believe with the Führer and us in the final total victory of the German people? Are you and the German people willing to work if the Führer orders 10, 12 and if necessary 14 hours a day, and to give everything for victory? Do you want total war, if necessary? Do you want a war more total and radical than anything that we can even imagine today? The response was overwhelmingly positive. Germany was put on a war footing for the first time. The production of consumer goods ended and factories were turned over to manufacturing war material on a massive scale. Slave labor from conquered countries was still used, but German workers were increasingly pushed to work longer and harder. Greater and greater sacrifices were called for in terms of effort, money, and lives. For many Germans, Stalingrad represented a crucial turning point in the war. In addition to this loss suffered by the Germans, there had been gains by the Red Army. The Soviet forces had grown larger with each month, as an increasing number of men were called up and more resources were poured into the manufacture of weapons. The success of Operation Uranus showed that the Russians were able to mimic German blitzkrieg tactics when the right men were in command and they had appropriate equipment. This was not always the case, and in the coming months the Russians would regularly fall back on their old tactics with often fatal results. But the improvement in the Russian forces could not be denied. The human cost of the Stalingrad campaign was immense. Among the greatest suffering was that endured by the civilian population of the city. On 23 August 1942, the city of Stalingrad had a population of 400,000 civilians. The fate of most of these people is unknown. Many fled, others joined the Red Army, but the majority were trapped in the city by the German advance and the refusal of the Soviet leaders to allow civilians to use the ferries to cross the river. It is thought that around 200,000 civilians were killed during the fighting. The casualties suffered by the Red Army were just as horrific. Several regiments and battalions were entirely wiped out. The official returns of the Red Army list 478,741 men killed and 650,878 wounded in and around the city, but this is generally thought to be an underestimation. The figures do not include the campaigns fought outside the city. The Soviets may have lost as many as 650,000 dead. There would be much fighting and bloodshed to come on the Eastern Front, but after Stalingrad there was no longer any chance that the Germans could win an outright total victory over the Soviet Union. There was talk among the senior military commanders of opening negotiations with the Russians to agree a peace deal. Hitler refused point blank. Unlike many of the military men, Hitler was fully aware of the mass murders, genocide, and other war crimes that the SS and other instruments of the Nazi Party had been carrying out in occupied Russia. He knew that the Russians were intent on vengeance and that talks were pointless. Later, the sure knowledge that he himself would be executed would lead Hitler to prolong the war needlessly, and finally to take his own life. Stalingrad marked the beginning of the end for the Third Reich.
The last letters from Stalingrad. My life hasn't changed at all. It's just like it was 10 years ago, blessed by the stars and kept apart from mankind. I never had any friends, as you know, because people never wanted anything to do with me. I was happy when I looked at the sky through my telescope and watched the stellar world, joyful like a child who gets to play with the stars. You were my best friend, Monica. You weren't lost, you were that. These are not times for jokes. This letter will take 15 days to reach your hands. By then, you will have already read in the newspapers what has happened here in the meantime. Don't think too much about it. Things will end up completely different anyway. Let others worry about figuring it out. What do you or I care about those people? I always thought in light years and felt in seconds. Even here, I have much to do related to the weather. There are 4 of us, and if it goes on like this, we'll be quite satisfied. Our task itself is very simple: recording temperature and humidity levels, data on cloud height and visibility. That's the extent of our duties. If a bureaucrat were to read what I'm writing, tears would fall from his eyes over the violation of service secrecy. Monica, what is our life in comparison to the millions of years of the starry sky? On this beautiful night, I see Andromeda and Pegasus above my head. I've been watching them for quite a while, and soon I'll be very close to them. My peace and contentment I owe to the stars, among which you are the most beautiful. The stars are immortal, and human life is like a speck of dust in the all. Around me, everything is collapsing. An entire army is dying. Day and night are burning, and 4 men are busy recording temperature and cloud altitude. I don't understand much about war. Not a single man has fallen by my hand. Not once have I fired my pistol, though it's loaded. But from what I know, there is no such clumsiness on the other side. I would have gladly kept counting stars for a couple more decades, but no doubt that now it would serve no purpose. Letter number 2. To the stars from the end of the world. I've once again taken your portrait and gazed at it for a long time. Etched in my memory remains that moment we lived together, the beautiful summer afternoon of the last year of peace, when we walked to our home through the blooming valley. When we first met, it was the voice of our hearts that spoke. Later came the voice of love and happiness. We spoke of ourselves and of the future that stretched before us like a brightly colored carpet. That colorful carpet no longer exists. The summer afternoon is gone, and so is the blooming valley. And we are no longer together. Instead of the vibrant carpet, An endless white field has spread before me. There is no summer now, only winter, and there is no future, at least not for me, and therefore not for you either. For a long time, I felt an inexplicable sensation, not knowing what it was, but today, I know. It is fear. Fear for you. Thousands of kilometers away, I felt as if you were beside me. When you receive this letter, dive into it and listen. Perhaps you will hear my voice in its lines. We are told that our struggle is for Germany, but few here truly believe that this absurd sacrifice will be of any use to our homeland. Letter number 3, the silence of my hands. You have to put this out of your mind, Margarita, and you must do it soon. I'd even advise you to do it radically. The more thoroughly you do it, the less painful the disappointment will be. From your letters, I see that you long to see me again. It's natural to crave that. I also long for you. Passionately, in fact. That's not what troubles me. What troubles me is that, between the lines, I sense a longing not just for the man and the lover, but for the pianist. I can read that quite clearly. This is not some strange confusion of feelings. It's not that I, who should be utterly miserable, have surrendered to my fate, and that the woman, who has every reason to be grateful I'm still alive, at least for now, resents the fate that has fallen upon me. At times I suspect a silent reproach rising against me, as if I were guilty of not wanting to play anymore. That is what you want me to confess. That's why you insist so much in your letters, asking for an explanation I would have preferred to give in person. Perhaps fate has brought us to a point where no escape is possible. I don't know if I'll have another chance to speak to you, so it's good that this letter reaches your hands now, and that you know, if someday I show up. My hands have been lost since early December. On the left, I'm missing the little finger. But worse is the right hand. My index, middle, and ring fingers are frostbitten. I can still lift a cup using my thumb and pinky. I feel helpless. Only when fingers are gone does one realize how necessary they are for even the smallest tasks. At best, I can still pull a trigger with my pinky. My hands are lost. But I can't spend my life shooting if I can no longer be useful in any other way. Or is that enough to be a forest ranger? That's macabre humor. And if I'm still writing, it's only to reassure you. Kurt Honke, whom I think you remember from the conservatory, class of 37, played the Appassionata on a grand piano set in the middle of Red Square. You don't witness things like that every day. The house had been blown up, but they rescued the piano and set it down in the street. Every infantry soldier passing by hit the keys at random. And I ask you, where else, if not here, can you find pianos in the street? I told you once, Kurt played on January 4th like never before. Soon he'll be on the front lines. Forgive me for using the word front. War has changed all of us and the world around us. When that young man returns home, we'll hear many admirable things about him. No doubt he will never forget those hours. The public spirit and atmosphere will make sure of it. It's a shame I'm not a writer. I'd like to put into words the sight of hundreds of soldiers, bundled in greatcoats, heads wrapped in blankets, huddled close together. Murmurs everywhere, but no one disturbed the moment. They were listening to Beethoven in Stalingrad, even if they didn't understand him. Are you happier now that you know the whole truth? Letter number 4. Too late for advice. Spare me your well-intentioned advice. Do you even realize the position you're putting me in? What kind of words are those? You wouldn't have acted this way if you had known how things really work. What does this even mean? You know I share your views. We've talked about it more than we should. But this is not something that can be written. Do you take the others for fools? If I'm writing now, it's only because I know perfectly well that nothing can happen. I had the sense to omit the sender's address, and you'll receive this letter through the usual channel. Even if someone knew who wrote these lines, there's no place safer for me right now than Stalingrad. It's so easy to say. Lay down your arms. Do you think the Russians are going to forgive us? You're an intelligent person. Why don't you ask your friends to stop resupplying ammunition and war materials? It's easy to hand out good advice, but things aren't going the way you imagine. Liberation of the peoples? That's meaningless. The peoples remain the same, only their masters change. And outsiders will always argue that the people must be freed from the master of the moment. In 1932, it would have been the right time to act. You know that perfectly well. And the opportunity was lost. 10 years ago, there was still the ballot. Not using it is now costing us that small thing we call life. Letter number 5. When hope runs out. This morning, at the combat post, Hannah persuaded me to write to you. For the past few weeks, I've hesitated to start this letter, always thinking that uncertainty was torturous, but still clinging to a glimmer of hope. I kept thinking about how things might end for me, and every night I'd fall asleep with the same thought. The uncertainty of our situation, constantly swinging between the hope for reinforcements and the looming prospect of defeat. But I also avoided facing the reality of how doubtful everything really is. Perhaps out of cowardice. 3 times I could have already been buried underground, but if it had happened, it would have come suddenly and unexpectedly. Now, things have changed. Since this morning, I know exactly what's going on. And since I now feel strangely free, you too must be freed from this fearful uncertainty. When I looked at the map, I shuddered. We are completely alone, without help from the outside. Hitler has abandoned us. This letter will only get out if the airfield remains in our hands. We are north of the city. The men in my battery suspect our isolation, but they don't know it as clearly as I do. It seems that we are approaching the end. Neither Hannes nor I will go into captivity. Yesterday, I saw 4 men taken prisoner by the Russians after our infantry briefly recaptured the airbase. No, I will not go to a prison camp. When Stalingrad has fallen, you will hear about it and read about it, and you will know that I did not return. Letter number 6. 2 roads left, heaven or Siberia. In the end, there's no point in rebelling against this, and if there were any way out, I'm sure I would have found it. Naturally, I've tried everything to escape this trap, but only 2 paths remain, up to heaven or off to Siberia. The best thing is to wait and see, because everything else, as already said, is pointless. Back home, some gentlemen will rub their hands in satisfaction since they get to keep their seats and positions. In more than one newspaper, you'll read beautiful and pompous words framed in thick black borders. They'll honor our memory. Don't be fooled by that stupid noise. I feel like smashing everything, but never have I felt so helpless. There's only one thing I keep telling myself. Stay healthy and you'll survive the worst of times. Health is the first condition for returning home. I'm not ready to give up the chair in my own house. If you return to the others, tell them this, just as it's written here. The higher one sits in a chair, the harder the fall. Letter number 7. The truth. You deserve to know. You are the wife of a German officer, and that is why you will receive what I'm about to tell you with stoicism and strength. The same strength you showed the day you stood on the train platform as I departed for the East. I've never been good at writing letters. Mine have never been longer than a single page. Today I had many things I wanted to tell you, but I'll postpone them for later. Later means 6 weeks from now if all goes well, and 100 years from now if it doesn't. You must be prepared for that. If things go well, we'll have time to talk about everything, and in that case, why should I try to write a long letter? Something I'm not good at anyway. And if things go badly, then words won't be of much use. You already know how deeply I'm connected to you, Augusta. We've spoken little or nothing about our feelings. I love you deeply, and you love me. So you must know the truth, and the truth is in this letter. The truth is the awareness of the bloodiest struggle in a hopeless situation. Misery, hunger, cold, renunciation, doubt, despair, and terrifying death. During my leave, I told you nothing of this. I never spoke of it in my letters either. When we were together, and that includes our correspondence, we were husband and wife, and war was just a hateful but inevitable shadow over our lives. But truth also means understanding that this is not merely something to lament. It is an objectively proven fact. My personal responsibility for what has happened cannot be denied. That responsibility, however, is 1 in 70 million. The proportion is small, but it exists. I do not intend to run from it, and I tell myself that by giving my life, I will have paid my debt. There's no need to speak of honor. Augusta, you will know when the time comes that you must be strong. Don't be bitter, and don't suffer too much because of my absence. I'm not a coward. It only saddens me that I cannot offer any great proof of my courage, except to die for this pointless cause, this crime. You know the HR motto, guilt acknowledged, guilt atoned. Don't forget me too quickly. Letter number 8, a slice of cake and a winter war. I'm writing you a few lines again now, even though I wrote you a letter just yesterday, and another one to Hans Miller. You can't say I never write to you. One of my comrades is taking this note with him. I send my heartfelt congratulations to Grandma for her 74th birthday, and regret not being able to eat birthday cake with her today. Are the bakeries fully stocked back home? Here we don't have cake, but once we get out of this, everything will return. In the meantime, we have to keep tightening our belts. Go to the savings bank, withdraw 50 marks, and buy a gift for Grandma. She'll be so happy. I'm sure the Bergers still have some coffee. The husband works in port administration. If they do, I'm certain they'll give you some. Just tell them it's for the birthday celebration. I've done the Bergers a lot of favors. I'm writing a lot of nonsense. But nonsense is better than writing nothing at all. One never knows if the bullet meant for them has already been cast. But don't worry about us. We're sure to get through this, and afterwards, we'll all take a nice 4-week leave. It's really cold here now. Is there snow over there too? Letter number 9. Waiting, counting, hoping. Everything around me is confused, tangled, to the point that I don't know what to do. Wouldn't it be better to put the ending at the beginning? Dearest Anna, you may be surprised to receive a letter that's almost comical at first glance, but if you read it calmly, you'll see it's not at all. You always saw me as a proper middle-class man, and I must admit you were right, especially when I used to stuff my breakfast bread into my briefcase. 2 slices on the left, 2 on the right, apples on top, and the thermos on top of that. The thermos had to lie across the apples so the butter wouldn't soften the bread. Those were the days. How did Uncle Herbert always put it? Days of reflection. Today I'm no longer a bourgeois man. In our shelter there's a pleasant warmth. We've dismantled a few cars and used the parts for the stove. Nobody should know that, of course, though we have bigger worries here. My office is next door. I mentioned it in a letter a few days ago. It used to belong to a captain. I'm telling you all this in detail, though I'd rather be writing about something else. But at the same time, I wouldn't. The situation seems serious. That's what everyone says. We're in the furthest rear zone. From time to time, we hear gunfire. If not for that, we'd forget there was a war at all. Things here are so calm, I could hold out for 100 years, but not without you. Of course, it won't last that long. We're counting every day on getting out of here. But those hopes conflict with the rumors. The army has been encircled for 7 weeks now. It can't last another 7. My leave was due in September, but I didn't get it, like many others. Yesterday morning, we were told that a third of us might be sent home. The medical company's senior sergeant claims he heard it. But it could still take days. Nobody here really knows what's going on. I haven't been with you in 8 months, so a few more days hardly matter. Sadly, I won't be able to bring you much, but I'll see what I can find in Lemberg. I'm already looking forward to the happy day when leave is granted, and even more so to seeing you and Mother. When I send the telegram, be sure to let Uncle Herbert know right away. It's a joy to look forward to something. That joy keeps me going. Especially since yesterday morning. Every day I mark a line on the calendar. Every line means I'm 1 day closer to you. Letter number 10. Death without glory. You know better than anyone how I always flinched, how I feared the East and the war in general. I was never a soldier, just a man in uniform. What good does that do me now, or those others who didn't flinch and weren't afraid? Yes. What good is it to any of us, the extras in this absurd performance? What will we gain from a so-called heroic death? I've played the role of a dead man on stage dozens of times, but it was only a role. You sat in velvet seats watching me, and my portrayal of death seemed real and convincing. It chills me now to realize how little stage death has in common with real death. Death always had to be heroic, fascinating, admirable. Death for a great cause, death that convinced. But what is it really, here and now? It's bursting apart, starving, freezing, little more than a biological function like eating or drinking. They drop like flies. No one cares. They're buried quickly. They lie scattered everywhere, without arms, without legs, without eyes, their bellies torn open. Someone should make a film out of this, to make the most beautiful death in the world impossible. This is Butcher's death, which will later be glorified on granite pedestals, with sculptures of dying warriors wrapped in heroic bandages. There will be novels, hymns, and solemn tributes. Churches will hold masses, but I want no part in the flock. I'm not seduced by the idea of rotting in a mass grave. I wrote something similar to Professor H. You and he will hear from me again. Don't be surprised if some time passes before that, because I've decided to take my fate into my own hands. Letter number 11. Cordon Rouge and the Silence of War. Tonight, O and I are having a magnificent and peaceful evening. Everything is quiet on the other side, not here. The Russian is calm, and we were able to finish early. A fine bottle of Cordon Rouge, enjoyed in complete peace, made the night especially pleasant. In the notes of the war diary, I read something by Binding and someone else. What subtle originality this man has in how he expresses the things that impress and move us out there. Everything subjective or secondary is removed. What shines through his words is only the truly essential, radiating from his spirit. We expect nothing from the grand decisions that those above will surely have to make someday. Of course, no one can say whether the rapid passing of time won't make those decisions shift. Up to now, there's been furious and relentless fighting for Hill X in the city and outside it. Generals and colonels have flirted with the idea that this very Hill X might hold some significance in world history. And not only generals. Every day, some positions are stormed, and every day the enemy, or we, depending on who holds them, are driven out. Neither side has yet figured out what the point is in taking them, even if they could be held. It seems that the small matters reflect the great ones. This long absence of success produces either a nearly incurable apathy or a kind of perseverance that is really just waiting in disguise. It's nearly 10 o'clock. I'm going to sleep as much as I can. The more you sleep, the less you feel hunger, because hunger is not poetic, it's brutal. I love you all very much. Letter number 12. Doubt, faith, and the final goodbye. And so now you know I will not be coming back. Please tell our parents carefully. I'm very shaken and full of doubt. I used to be confident and strong. Now I feel small and skeptical. Many things happening here I will never fully understand, but the little I have witnessed is already too much to bear. They won't convince me, no one will, that my comrades died with the word Germany or the cry Heil Hitler on their lips. People die, and death is not something that can be faked. The last word is always for one's mother, or for the person they love most, or simply a cry for help. I've seen hundreds fall and die, and many of them, like me, came from the Hitler Youth. But nearly all, if they had strength left, called for help or cried out a name, someone who couldn't help them. Hitler had firmly promised to get us out of here. That's what we were told, and we truly believed it. And I still believe in it, because I still need to believe in something. But if this promise isn't true, what can I believe in? If it isn't true, I have no need for spring, summer, or anything else that brings joy. Let me speak of my faith, dear Greta. I've believed all my life, or at least for 8 years, in the Führer and in his word. It's terrifying to see how full of doubt and shame the people here are when faced with truths that cannot be denied, because reality itself speaks louder than anything else. If what we were promised isn't true, then Germany is lost. Because in that case, no word, no oath will ever mean anything again. Oh, these doubts, these terrible doubts, if only they could vanish. Letter number 13, A Cold Christmas by the Volga. Unfortunately, the Christmas I have to tell you about wasn't very cheerful, but at least we were warm. Our position is right on the banks of the Volga. We managed to get some rum, not very strong, but it tasted great. One of my comrades brought a few things from the division, ham and cold cuts in jelly. I'm sure he scraped them from the kitchen, but they tasted wonderful. Besides, the kitchen must be well stocked with those things, otherwise he wouldn't have been able to steal anything. Bread is very scarce, so we made a kind of cake. We mixed flour, water, and salt in a pan and added pieces of ham. Of course, the flour didn't exactly come from our garden. This is my 4th Christmas at war, but this one was the saddest of them all. When the war ends, we'll need to recover from everything, and hopefully next year we can celebrate Christmas at home. We've been in Stalingrad for 3 months now, and we haven't moved a single step forward. It's quite calm here, but across the river, out on the steppe, the fighting is intense. Our comrades on the steppe aren't as lucky as we are. They've had it rough. Maybe we'll be sent there next because their losses are heavy. But it's better not to think about it. And yet, we keep thinking about it. Especially when you have 24 hours a day with nothing to do except try not to think. That's when your thoughts drift back to the land where you were born. Did you all think of me on Christmas night? I had that strange feeling, the kind that comes over you when you know someone is thinking of you. Letter number 14, With gratitude and head held high. The moment has come again to send you my greetings and to ask that you also greet your loved ones and pass along my affection. The Russians are attacking everywhere. Our troops have been holding out since the beginning of the offensive, which hasn't stopped for a single day, fighting fiercely, physically exhausted. They are acting like heroes, and not a single one of them has surrendered. The fact that the enemy overcomes us when we run out of bread, ammunition, fuel, and men is no victory for him. God knows this well. We are certain that we've been the victims of serious command errors, and that the destruction of the Stalingrad stronghold will bring great harm to our people and to the nation as a whole. Yet even so, we believe in a future rebirth of our people. Surely men of true heart will take care of that. A task awaits you at home, to make sure that no madmen, fools, or criminals are allowed to continue their work. Those who return must sweep them away like the wind sweeps away chaff. We are Prussian officers. We know what our duty is when the moment arrives. When I look back at my life, I realize I can do so with deep gratitude. It has been beautiful, wonderfully beautiful, like ascending a staircase, and even this final step, its crown, is beautiful. I could almost say it is harmonious and complete. Tell my parents not to be sad. Let them remember me with joyful hearts. No talk of glory. I've never been an angel, and I won't present myself as one before the Lord either. But I will present myself as a soldier, with the soul of a nobleman, free and proud as a gentleman. I do not fear death in the slightest. My faith gives me this calm clarity, and with that clarity comes a deep sense of thankfulness. Pass on this legacy to those who come after us. Raise them to be noble in spirit. Let there be rigorous simplicity in thought and in behavior. No compromise. Give all your love and help to my parents as they face the first days of grief. Like my Uncle X, place a beautiful and simple wooden cross for me in the cemetery at the park. Keep she as the family seat of the X's. That is my greatest wish. In my desk, there is a letter I wrote during my last leave where I explained all of this in detail. Now I place myself in the love of you all, and I thank you once more. Thank you, and keep your heads high. Always forward. A warm embrace to all. Letter number 15. If there is a God. If there is a God, you wrote in your last letter, he will bring you back to me soon, safe and sound. A man like you continued, who loves animals and flowers, who harms no one, who loves and honors his wife and son, is always under God's protection. Thank you for those words. I always carry your letter with me, tucked inside my pack. But dearest, if you weigh your words carefully, and you make the existence of God depend on this outcome, then you're facing a grave and terrible decision. I am a religious man, and you have always been a believer, but now, it must be different. If we both draw conclusions from what our personal path has been until now, then we must admit, something has occurred that makes everything we believed in seem like an illusion. Don't you suspect it already? There's such a strange tone in your last letter from December 8th. We are now in mid-January. This will be my last letter for a long time, perhaps forever. One of my comrades, who is heading to the airfield, will carry it with him. Tomorrow, the last plane takes off from that airstrip. The situation has become unsustainable. The Russians are 3 kilometers away from the last airbase. If it falls, not even a rat will escape from here, and neither will I. It's true that hundreds of thousands of others will also be trapped, but it's small comfort to drown in company. If there is a God. On the other side, there are many who say the same. In England and France, surely millions. I no longer believe that God is merciful. Otherwise, he would not have allowed such injustice. I no longer believe because otherwise God would have enlightened the minds of the men who started this war. Men who spoke of peace and of the Almighty in 3 different languages. I no longer believe in God because he has betrayed us. I no longer believe. Now you must decide what you will do with your faith. Letter number 16. Christmas Mass. Amid ruins. On the eve of the Holy Feast, 11 comrades joined with devotion in a religious service held inside a relatively intact hut. It wasn't easy to find them among the crowd of skeptics, the desperate and the disillusioned. But those I did find came with joyful and open hearts. It was a curious little group that I gathered to celebrate the nativity of the Christ child. There are many altars in this vast world, but none poorer than the one we had here. Yesterday there were still grenades in the crate on which I placed the gray field tunic of a fallen comrade, the one whose eyes I closed just last Friday in that very room. I wrote his wife a letter of comfort. May God lay his merciful hands upon him. I read to my men the story of the Nativity from the Gospel of Luke, chapter 2, verses 1 through 17. The words of a noble Gentile Christian. I gave them hard black bread as a holy sacrifice and sacrament of the altar, as the true body of Jesus Christ, and I prayed for forgiveness and mercy on their behalf. I did not speak of the 5th commandment. The men sat on stools and small benches, eyes wide open in their hunger-worn faces, gazing up at me. They were all young. Only one among them was 51. I feel peace in knowing that I was able to bring some comfort and strength to their hearts. When we finished, we all joined hands, shared our home addresses, and promised that those of us who made it out alive would visit the families of this small group and tell them how we celebrated Christmas Eve of 1942. May God stretch out his merciful hands over you, beloved parents, for night is falling, and we would do well to put our affairs in order before death comes. We are carried by the night, and into the night we go, if it is the will of the Lord of the universe. But we do not go into an endless night. We place our lives in the hands of God, and may he forgive us when our hour arrives.